Welcome back, any and all, to my presentation on Bible geometry. This is number 2, the canon of biblical numbers and their origin, or God's design language of the cosmos. If this is the first one of these you're seeing, be advised that there is a previous presentation in this lineup that gives a brief introduction to the concepts and ideas that I'll be going over, but as for now, we have to get an idea of the canon of biblical numbers, so that we can know what those numbers refer to when we come across them in the Bible. If you didn't know, numbers are a language, and just like words, can communicate ideas all on their own. This word canon here, when you talk about something that is canonical, it is within the rules, right? That is from a Hebrew word kone, meaning rule, and from the Greek word canon, meaning rule. So canon is the correct term to use in my title, because it means the rule of numbers. When you read the measurings of these things in your Bible, you might ask, why are the numbers, shapes, and symbols important? Well, they're in your Bible, you know that they are important, but what's the big deal? Well, just like letters and words, numbers are carriers of information. When used as a language, numbers and ratios are associated with certain real objects or come to represent that object. Numbers, symbols, and forms are universal regardless of the spoken tongue of a person, much like music. Some of this geometry stuff we'll be going over has a lot to do with music, which I may bring up as we go along. But that's very important to know. The concept of three things, well, it doesn't matter what language a person speaks. You could take a group of people from all corners of the globe, and they all understand what 3 is, and they all understand what a line is, and could probably tell the difference between a circle and a square, even though they don't speak the same language. Much like isolated notes, letters, and words, numbers don't mean anything on their own, but when they occur in repeated and relational patterns, they form their own language. In fact, I would venture to say that numbers themselves, as an abstract concept, are more real than the things they represent. For example, if you have 3 apples, over the course of time, you're not going to have 3 apples anymore. They're going to turn into something else. They're going to get corrupted and waste away. But the concept of 3 transcends, if you want to say, all time and space. There's always going to be 3 of something, even if the somethings themselves cease to exist. So imagine if you had a page with scrambled letters all over it. Those letters on their own only represent sounds and not ideas, but you can take the letters and put them together in an intelligible way that create words, and words carry a little bit of meaning on their own. But unless it's a higher order word that can communicate an idea by itself, you're not going to get much out of a single word so much as you would putting together words in patterns that created a sentence that could communicate a more complex or a more full idea. Those sentences you can use to make paragraphs to expand on the idea, and before you know it, you have a book. It's the same way with numbers, and I've got a few examples of that we'll see in a moment. These numbers we're going to see are embedded in our everyday phenomena. We are totally unable to understand the world and other people without numbers, even if we don't always notice it. So this is to head off 2 criticisms that I could see of the things I'm going to present in these presentations. Someone's going to say, well, these things are coincidences, or they're random, and what they mean when they say it's a coincidence is it's meaningless. But I don't think these things are coincidences. There used to be a time in my life where I thought that coincidences were real things, but part of studying the Bible has taken me away from that belief. But I understand where they're coming from because I was once there, so I'll give you one coincidence. You can have one coincidence. But when you have 2, I start to be doubtful that it's random. And when you have 3, or like I'm going to present to you, dozens that are all the same, that's not random. That's not a coincidence anymore. Something is being communicated. Whether we understand what it is or not, at least we can understand that someone's trying to say something. For example, 365. What does this number refer to? And immediately you say, aha, that represents a year. There are 365 days in a year. And I'll let you know beforehand, you've already been psychologically manipulated. So ha ha ha. Because now, when I show you the next number, you're already thinking about time measures in terms of days. You made the connection at 365. Now when you see 7, you say, oh, of course, 7 days in a week. Likewise, your brain's still in that same vein of dates. 12 months in a year. 24 hours in a day. Now you see these numbers, 365, 7, 12, 24. A person with no concept of time or date might see these numbers in a math class and think nothing of it. But these four numbers being on your screen right now, you instantly recognize we're talking about days, months, weeks, and years. 7-Eleven. Maybe you get the idea of stopping for an emergency break on a long road trip, or maybe the terrible price of gas at these places. 110 degrees. Well, when you're talking about geometry, you may be describing the angle where two lines meet, but if you live where I do, you know that this is sometime in July or August, and it is a sickening day outside. If you're American, I don't need to explain that number to you. Now these are numbers separated by a diagonal. 1225, well, Merry Christmas. If you're from other parts of the world, this number may not mean too much to you, but in America, well, that's voting day. Same here. Tax day. What about numbers you see in the Bible that come up often? 40. 40 years wandering the wilderness, 40 days and 40 nights of rainfall, 40 days fasting in the wilderness. 144,000, one of the famous numbers from the book of Revelation, which itself is full of numbers. 12,000. That's 12,000 times 12 makes 144,000. What about other numbers? These numbers we have here on the left side of the screen and in the middle, we've recognized. We can tell what they refer to, where they are in the Bible. What about 792? What about 1056? Or 528? 216? 864? Okay. Well, over here on the left, we've got some very familiar numbers, and over here on the right, we've got some numbers that maybe you've never seen or have never thought about. But I'll tell you that those numbers on the right are just as significant as those other numbers in the Bible. And they come up even more often than other numbers you see in the Bible. And whenever I mention the number 40 or 144,000, you instantly have ideas in your brain of what that's referring to. You know the context that those numbers are in and what they're being used to communicate. These numbers on the right, maybe you don't. And you'll notice that 3 of these numbers have colors assigned to them. As we go on in these presentations, you'll come to realize what I'm using those colors to denote. Maybe you're being quite serious about these presentations and keeping notes. And if you are, please write down 792, 528, 216, and 864. They are invaluable whenever we get on to explaining what these numbers mean. And if you're casually listening and just seeing what you can pick up, make a mental note of these numbers. By the end of this, if you come back to watch this presentation again, you're going to know what those numbers mean, and you're going to realize why I put them here and why they're so significant. 660, that's related to 792, and you may notice that 528 is half of 1056, and you may know that 216 is 1/4 of 864. Well, what about the number 6 in the Bible? You may never have considered that this integer, one number, carries a whole host of information with it. But watch what happens in your brain. This is the number of creation. God finished his work in how many days? Jesus was on the cross for how many hours? It's also a number indicating man, for the capstone of God's creation was on the 6th day. What is that most famous number from Revelation? The number of a man. Seeing as we're talking about geometry, there are 6 sides of a cube, and in 3-dimensional space, of course, you can go up, down, left, right, forward, or backwards. When we get to the book of Ezekiel, we'll discuss what the reed in Ezekiel's cubits are all about, but just know that in one reed there are 6 of his cubits. Wings of a seraph. Months between John and Jesus' birthdays, that's John the Baptist, or if you want to think about it in Old Testament terms, unleavened bread to booths. Earth's orbital speed is 66,600 miles per hour. That's on average. You probably know that snowflakes all have 6 spokes. That's because of water's molecular mass being 18 grams per mole. It's also carbon's atomic number, and that's very significant because all biological life on Earth is based in carbon. And of course, famous Bible numbers, well, 6 plus 6 is 12, and 6 times 6 is 36. When we talk about the stars, I'll probably mention this again, but there are 48 constellations. That is 12 signs in the zodiac, and each one has 3 associated with it. So 12 and 36. Okay, let's get into the polygons. Gon is an angle. Poly means many. The circle. Now, there may be some people that would argue that this is not a polygon, but where else do you put this? The circle's kind of unique. It's divided into 360 degrees, and as far as I've heard, the Sumerians are credited with dividing the circle into 360 degrees, but it's my suspicion that they learned that from someplace earlier. They also thought of the year as having 360 days, so they took that to say that 1 degree of the sky, or the way the zodiac moves across the sky, is equivalent to 1 day. And then we divide those degrees of the circle into a more minute division of 60 minutes per degree and a second order of minuteness of 60 seconds per minute. So right here we have 360 by 60 is 21,600. That's one of our first occurrences of this number 216 in the natural order of things. And if we take that to seconds, 21,600 by 60 is 1,296,000. Well, if you put two lines together, you can't make any sort of shape, but the next one we come to is 3 lines. The triangle has, well, 3 angles and 3 sides of 60 degree per angle and 180 degrees total. So if you want to think of it like this, the triangle is half the value of a circle. The square we talked about a little bit in our introduction. It has 4 sides and 4 angles of 90 degrees per angle, giving us a total of 360. That is a very unique thing that the square and the circle have in common, and why they are in some ways a reflection of one another. The pentagon has 5 sides and 5 angles, and is 108 degrees per angle. This is another very significant number that we're going to see pop up all over the place, and we can use 108 for a variety of fun things down the line. So that's a total of 540 degrees. Now is a good time to note as well that 108 is half of 216. The hexagon. Now remember all those things we associated with the number 6 earlier. Here's a 2-dimensional representation of that. 6 sides, 6 angles, 120 degrees per angle. Hey, there's our 12 creeping back in. So that's 720 total. And the hexagon is where geometry really begins to get interesting and kind of blossom to me. Whether you think we have 8 planets or 9, of course you know that Saturn is counted the 6th planet from the Sun. And what is at its north pole but the shape of a hexagon? Now what a coincidence, if indeed it is a coincidence, that the 6th planet from our Sun has a 6-sided polygon on it. That is quite amazing to say the least, but who knows? The skeptic or the reductionist would say that, well, it's just a coincidence with no meaning to be inferred. And of course, Saturn had 12 suns. We measure our days in terms of 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. And then chronos, when we say something is chronological, chronos is father time in the Greek stories. And we measure our time in 60 minutes, 60 seconds. In discussing the hexagram, I would like to preface it by saying that there is a group of people on our Earth that use this for a different way than I'm going to use it just talking about geometry. I don't want to be associated with what they're doing with it. I just want to show it as a shape. It's merely a construction of lines. It doesn't need to have any cultural connotations assigned to it at this point, but it is a very good way to show the relationship between the hexagon and the circle is that 6 of the circle's radius fit neatly around the perimeter, and that's how a hexagon is formed. Also, this hexagram contains a hexagon and 6 triangles. Of course, the alchemists had their symbols for the 4 classical elements, constructed from this very same thing. And here's where we begin to see the beginnings of 3D space, when we pie off a hexagon, you might be able to squint or cross your eyes or shake your head enough to make that not be a divided hexagon, but to see it in 3 dimensions as a cube. If you're having trouble with that, you can look at this image. The octagon, 8 sides, 8 angles, 135 degrees per angle, and here we've come back to our 108 number. There's 1080 degrees total on the interior of the octagon. Decagon, 10 sides, 10 angles, and here we have our occurrence of 144 per angle, giving us 1440 total. And the dodecagon, 12 sides, 12 angles, 150 degrees per angle, giving us 1800 total. And then, of course, the sum of each exterior angle would be 360 degrees. Okay, now we can enter into the 3-dimensional shapes, the regular polyhedra, but so not to overwhelm you, I'll tell you that there's only 5, don't be worried. And polyhedra, well, that's where we get our word for head, many faces. First one we come to is the tetrahedron. Remember, our total triangle angles came to 180. Well, times 4, we get 720. A 3D view of one spinning around. And maybe you recognize that cube. 6 times 360. We've come again to our 216 number. There's 2,160 total degrees in a cube. And the cube has an interesting property when we start thinking about Christian symbolism, in that whenever you unfold a cube, it makes a cross with 6 segments of equal dimension. Here's a shape with 8 faces, the octahedron, once again coming to 1440. I like this animation because it has a little snake that goes around it. The icosahedron, that is 20 faces that are all triangles, comes to a nice 3,600. So there's our 360 coming back around to us. And the dodecahedron, that's 12 faces that are all pentagons, so the total of that is 6,480 degrees. 648 is another important number as we go along. It's not as crucial to remember as the others I've mentioned, but we will see it a lot as we go forward. That's the end of our presentation on basic shapes. Once again, this is all in introduction. I just wanted to get you to thinking about the idea that numbers are used oftentimes to communicate very high order levels of information, and also to get you started thinking or familiar with seeing these numbers that have already come up several times in discussing these most basic of theoretical shapes. We've seen 216 and 108, 12, 360, 144 come up over and over again. And whenever we start measuring things in the Bible, and whenever we start looking at other places in our natural world for these numbers, I think you'll be very impressed at what these things represent. So join us next time. The next presentation will be on units of measure. And we'll be going over a lot of Bible measurements as well as common modern day measurements in that. Until then.